I love the recent series of The Mandalorian and I wanted to capture a slice of it. First I built this Mandalorian figure, and you can check that video out. Then I had to make him a home. So this is a slice of Tatooine. When I bought my 3D design file for The Mandalorian, Gambody also do this speeder bike, and I wanted it. This is going to be 8th scale, so it's a large print. So I put it to go on my Peopoli Phenom. The first print was 29 hours, the second one was 28. It takes time, but it was really easy, and at the end of it, I had the two main pieces, a couple of handlebars, and a pipe. Don't worry, I did get them the right way round in the end. And that's it really. It's a very simple print. If you do the FDM version, you can get a lot more variety. But there's support nubs. You get this with all 3D printing in resin. I tend to do them a little bit large and then just sand, wet sand in this instance, sand them back. The wet sanding helps with the dust, which isn't good for you. Mounting it was going to be fun. They provide this sort of mount from the side which goes into their base, but I didn't want it from the side because there's going to be a wall just where that is. So I decided to fill the hole instead and mount it from underneath, and then I'm going to prop a jetpack up and hide it. Subtle, I know. Assembly was really simple. Glue it together and stick this pipe in, and for that I used 5-minute epoxy. The trick is not to use so much that it oozes out when you put it together, and then just to prop it up somewhere and leave it. Once that was done, I just used super glue to add that pipe. A little bit of acrylic putty sanded smooth hided any sins. I should have hollowed this. It would have saved me a lot of money when I printed it, and it would have been a lot lighter for mounting. I'm not quite sure why I didn't, but I didn't. I drilled a pilot hole underneath. One advantage of it not being hollowed, it's solid all the way through, and decided what I was going to do. I had 2 solid wood bases from an art project from my 5th year at school. Yes, my art teacher's husband made these, and I still have them. Haven't got that project anymore, but they were the perfect mounts for this speeder bike, nice and solid and heavy, and a perfect size hole for this supplied mount stick. So I cut it to size and put it in place. I'm going to hold it by this, so I need it to be firm, so I used more 5-minute epoxy to glue it in place, and whilst it was drying I weighted it level so it looked right. I wanted to add some detail, so I added the throttle cables. I just hand drilled the holes, more for control than anything else, and threaded in some magnet wire, it's a thin copper wire, glued it in place with super glue. And now it's time to paint it. I start off with a black automotive car primer. This is Halford Spray Black Matte Paint. I actually should have done it in grey, so I went over it again in grey. This is Tamiya Fine Surface Primer, and it's a much closer colour to the colour I actually need to paint it, so I don't need to worry now about painting it anything else. This grey will suffice. I left the seat and saddlebags in black though, and painted those with the same paints that I'd used on the Mandalorian, so they tied together. I think it's important that diorama elements do that. 2 thin coats of a base, followed by dry brushing in a lighter grey. I wasn't totally happy with the colour though. I think it needed more brown, so I went over with a dilute pale brown. This is just normal acrylic paint thinned with water. When I'd put that coat on, I dry brushed again with a slightly different lighter dust coloured paint. And when that coat had dried, I added a neutral brown wash. All of the washes I use on this bike are enamel washes, which means they're basically an enamel paint in white spirit, and you can clean them back off again with white spirit if you put too much on. But they do like to dry in the nooks and crannies, and they give a great effect. The saddlebag's got exactly the same treatment. 2 coats of a brown base coat, a dry brush in a paler brown, followed by a brown wash. I'd added metallic, which hadn't worked, and then I'd added a matte varnish to get rid of the metallic, but the predominant colour underneath is dust, so I sprayed the underneath of everything with a very, very pale dust colour. And now it was time for the washes. I needed this grey paint to have some interest to it, so I smeared on a lot of black wash. I mean a lot of black wash. I like to put it on too heavily and then wear it off to take it off. It's a technique and I find it really effective on large flat surfaces like this. To add some variety, I liberally put on some brown and neutral washes too. And then I just let it all dry for about an hour or 2. At this point, I removed the the majority of the wash. A bit of paper towel, a bit of white spirit, and you can take off very carefully most of that wash, but leave it in the edges, in the cracks, in the nooks and crannies. You can also leave some on the surfaces, just as a little bit of extra colouring. I find it a really effective method for adding a general patterner and streaks. It's brilliant for streaks. I used screenshots from the series to work out where I needed more colour and variety. So I used washes on the handlebars and brought out the actual print itself has a lot of eroded detail in it. So I went through and highlighted all of that and emphasised any rusty areas or streaks that just needed a bit more detailing. I super glued the seat in place and the saddlebags just snap on. I put them there so I had a feel of the whole bike's colouring, and then I got on with painting any details that needed more. First up, some black grey on the handlebars and on the saddle area, before moving on to that rusty bit underneath. It's a huge rusty area, so I used a rust coloured paint and then decided to add some pigments. These are rust-coloured model pigments, and I used matte medium to glue them on with a nice crusty finish. And then I just looked at the photos and painted any areas that weren't quite grey, including the little red squares at the end, and the silvery bits on the throttles just looked a bit brighter than the rest of the bike. I suspect they get more worn. I painted those throttle cables and did a little bit of silver highlighting and some scratches on the handlebars. I didn't go overboard on it before I moved on to the dust coat. There's a couple of layers to this, and the first is a dilute acrylic paint. It's thinned right down and takes it from this to this. I'm going to be honest though, on videos it's easy to gloss over the troubles and trials and tribulations that you had. Well, if you put this paint on too thin, which is what you want a light dust coat, it just balls on the surface because the washes are enamel and they just seem to give it a slightly glossy finish, which the paint doesn't like. So you end up putting it on a lot thicker than you like, but unlike the washes, it doesn't come off when it's dry. So then you have to go over it with some water and try and get it just right before it all sets up too much. I did eventually get there and got it into a routine, put it on, smear it off. And on some of the flatter areas, I put streaks in. I did debate this because obviously streaks relate to water falling down generally, but it gives it some texture and I wanted it to look weathered and worn. The second part of my dust coat was tile grout. Yes, I used tile grout. Why? Well, it's the right colour and it's very cheap, and there's a lot of this beast to cover. It's going to match perfectly, and just a rough brush, it sticks to the fairly matte surface. So I have a speeder bike. I also have my Mandalorian, and they both need a home. So I measured out a diorama that fit exactly on the top shelf of a bookcase I've got. I'm trying to actually display my dioramas rather than leave them in cardboard boxes. So it's easy enough to cut and snap and use up some old pieces and then hot glue together a foam base. Now bases, let's face it, they're not the most exciting thing on earth, are they? But they're vital, and here's why. I had just finished my last video and I put him on a base. I knew it wasn't secure. In my head, I knew it wasn't quite secure. And when I walked out the room and heard him fall with a great big smash, I knew it wasn't secure. Why do you do it? Why do you do it? Anyway, one new left arm later, I never did find some of the bits. Well, actually, I found them 3 weeks later, which wasn't much help. But I repainted a new left arm, and this base is going to be rock solid. So I am using the wooden base that I have, and I put a little bit of wood in there with loads of hot glue to make sure he has something firm to stand on. And to put him there, I'm going to use magnets because you can take him off when you're doing the scenery. I just drill a hole the right size, use some 5-minute epoxy, and then put a plastic bag between the magnet already in his foot and the one on the base so he doesn't stick to the 5-minute epoxy, and I leave him to stand. Foam can be quite soft and I've got some gaps, so I used Sculptor Mould, which is a plaster paper mache mix, and I put it into all the gaps. I put it round the back of his foot so that the back magnet had something to actually stick against, and then I used it on the front as well as a skim layer. So this is a diorama without a sort of nice frame, it's got a skim at the front. When it was dry, I reinforced the back magnet with thin super glue to make sure it never came out. Tatooine has quite distinctive buildings, and mine are made from a friend's extension offcuts. These are Celotex insulation foam. I've peeled the foil cover off the outside and carved them with a kitchen knife. You can't use hot tools, and they're very dusty, so I do recommend you wear a mask. I put one piece side on, it's a thinner piece, and used it as one of those bits that stick out on the buildings. It's quite typical. It also acts as a frame on that end. I cut everything out, tested it together, and then stuck it together using copious amounts of hot glue and cocktail sticks. Now, this didn't work entirely because it's so powdery it just falls apart really quickly, so I ended up putting a brace on the back with some foam core onto the foil, which was at least well stuck. Now I needed to plaster it. I used 3 parts sand for a gritty texture, 3 parts tile grout for the cement in it and for the colour, and then I just filled it up with a thin PVA. This is decorator's PVA I had on the side. Should have sieved the tile grout, it was lumpy. But it brushed on very easily, it's very thin this first coat. And I smeared it all over, top sides, everywhere, and down the gap. And when it was dry, I was able to sand it, yeah, you can sand it, and get rid of any of the lumps that were there. To get a really good look though, you need to build up several coats of this. So again, equal parts, grout, sand. I didn't put quite as much glue in this mix, and I sieved it and it went on far more smoothly. You can build this layer up quite thickly, so I used it to even out my 2 sides which weren't quite balanced, and then I smoothed everything off and left it to dry. The end result is gritty, but not quite gritty enough because of the grout. So I did another coat with just sand to get the texture that I wanted. But now it looks like a beach. So I used matte medium, water and tile grout, first of all a beige tile grout, to create a really thin paint almost. It's going to be the perfect texture and it will match the ground that we're going to make out of this tile grout. You do need to go over it several times as you get little fine bubbles. And when that was dry, I added some white tile grout and put a really pale mix over the top, just for that bloom you get on concrete. Finally, I sprayed a brown acrylic wash, videos linked above, and it just added a little bit of texture to it. I wanted to add that iconic scene from the first series with the Stormtrooper helmets on spikes and in the rubble beneath. I found this design on Prusa and I printed it on my Peopoly Phenom. There'll always be some layer lines like this on the curved domes, but not to worry, we'll sort those in a minute. First up though, I drilled holes for 5 of them to sit on spikes. There's 15 in total. Then I put some battle damage on with a knife. I haven't UV cured these pieces yet, so they're still quite soft. The supports are all underneath, so a quick clean up and a quick sand, and I cured them and they were ready for their primer coat. I used white Tamiya fine primer for this. To get rid of those visible layer lines, I did a bit of sanding with 1800 grit paper and a little bit of filling with acrylic putty, but I didn't exactly go overboard on it. They're going to be well weathered. And for that weathering, I started by browning them up with a biscuit coloured acrylic paint. They've been sat around for a long time and they're no longer white, so I wanted to reflect that here. Now this paint is matte, so I sprayed a gloss white from above on the tops of those helmets to add just a little bit of lightness back in and to give the feeling of gloss that you do get on Stormtrooper helmets. I checked the photos and painted the grey. This is a little bluer perhaps than I meant it to be. I thought the yellow in the later coats would tone it down a bit. But I went through and painted everything grey, added a black grey to the darker bits. I don't think you should ever do black really on models that have been weathered. It just never stays that pristine. And when all that was dry, I added some black wash. Now I put this everywhere quite heavily. You know me, plaster it on, take it off, and I did the same technique here. I sat them all on their backs and added black wash at the front in quite a heavy amount and left it to dry overnight. And then I added some dark black, red, Vallejo colour as blood, dried blood. And then I did battle damage with a bit more of the black grey, detailed up some of those smears and scuffs that they needed, the battle damaged area, and got out my neutral wash. I put this on quite finely, but almost all over the bottom area, and then left the tops a bit paler. You can see the difference it makes here. The picture showed a little bit more streaking on the top of the helmet, so I went through and added some more of the enamel wash quite thickly and then just smeared it up. I raided my stash to add some crates to the right hand side. These are Blott's 28mm terrain sci-fi crates, and I didn't use the big one. I sprayed them with primer, white ink, a pale yellow colour, a darker yellow colour, then a brown ink. Finally, when that was dry, I added a brown or neutral wash, and then when that was dry, I added tile grout. And they're going to get mostly covered up so you won't even see them, but sometimes you just need to add a little bit more detail into some areas. So now we've got a bunch of pieces, but we need to put them all together. But first of all, some spikes for my Stormtroopers. I carved these out of some strip wood that I had. I want to make the back removable for ease of transport and perhaps photo lines. So I use cling film, it stops it sticking. I use sculpt mould to fill the gap because there is one between where I carved it and this back edge, and to build up the bit around his back foot so it looks realistic. The cling film also stops him from sticking to it. It was easy enough to shove in those sticks and then paint them with a dark black grey. It always pays to paint your base, so I use neutral craft acrylic paint with a lot of water in it so it's nice and thin. I sprayed the edges with brown wash because that's all they're getting, this paint and brown wash. For the main surface, I used an equal mix of sand and tile grout and plugged the holes that I had, and then I used a sieve. This is a precision snow and ice sieve, but it gives a lovely texture, and I threw the tile grout into the edges to make sure they went right up to the wall. I'd buried the magnets for mounting Mando, so I cleaned them off, checked he still fitted, and titivated around his feet. I then added some woodland scenic talus and placed the Stormtrooper helmets in place before covering them in tar grout and then cleaning them up. I needed to use the brush to sort of scoop it around them and build it up as if it had blown in there, and then I added texture across the whole area. This isn't a smooth street. I added the rest of the details and made sure the tar grout was built up around them. It doesn't look good if it's too smooth, but when you've done all this, another fine layer over the top beds everything together. Once, and only once you're happy, it's time to glue it. I start off with a pale mist of isopropyl alcohol and water, third isopropyl alcohol, and then a fine mist of 1/6 matte Mod Podge and water before moving on to the bottles. This is a very thick, drifted mix by now, and despite the sand in there, sometimes it doesn't always sit properly. If you do get any patches like this, don't worry. Soak them again with the isopropyl alcohol and water mix, and then use the dilute matte Mod Podge. And then at the end you can go over them with a little bit more sand and tar grout. And actually that's what I did around my Stormtroopers. More sand to build it up, more tar grout across the whole thing just to get the colour right. It was looking a bit too sandy. I covered it again with the isopropyl alcohol and water mix and more dilute matte Mod Podge. My hand was getting tired with the spray, so I stuck to the bottle. You need to put it on fairly thickly to make sure everything is well glued through all the layers. I put the speeder bike in place and used the natural acrylic paint to cover up the mount. I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sold on this. This is what it looks like in the final version. I considered clear acrylic, maybe adding grout to it. It's easy enough in Photoshop just to get rid of it. Or to use my subterfuge of his jetpack that I painted up just for fun. I would love to hear how you would have done it, so please let me know in the comments below. And now it's time to add the soft furnishings. I tried a couple of things. I never got rid of the bumps on the first issue, and the second one just fell apart. So I went for this really stretchy material I had sat around, sprayed it with isopropyl alcohol, note the cling film underneath so it doesn't actually stick when I paint it and glue it, covered it with dilute matte Mod Podge and some brown acrylic wash. Then I came back the next morning. Nothing that couldn't be sold with a coat of paint. Just some Tamiya acrylics, and then when it was dry I was able to almost get the cling film off. Thankfully you can just pull it and stretch it off if it's stuck, and then you just put it back in place. Because I'd used the cling film, it didn't sit quite onto the layer underneath, and I hate that. That black line at the bottom just screams model to me. So I filled the gap with more tile grout, and because I was just using tile grout without any sand in it, the glue doesn't spread very easily, so you do have to do multiple thin layers. The very last thing to do was a distinctive feature of Tatooine, and that's a canopy. I tore some plain cotton material, cut some holes in it, and then used a brass brush to distress it. I cut the ends a bit more and distressed it a little bit more until it looked nice and tattered. The Stormtrooper helmets that are hanging on the spikes also have some material hanging down, so I cut that out at the same time. I used black-red acrylic paint by Vallejo with a bit of water in there to dye them all. You put it in, soak them for a bit, pull them out and spread them on some foil to dry. I actually did 3 dips of this, and the last one for the tassels and the helmets was in black-grey, with some random colours thrown in on the canopy too. I used an enamel rust colour diluted with a bit of white spirit to make the spikes look a bit rustier, and I cleaned up the top of the helmets that were looking a little bit too stark on the gap between the original white paint and the sort of wash that had got on. This dust had stuck to it too much. Finally, I distressed those tassels a little bit more with a brass brush and a knife, cut a hole in the top, distressed that, slipped the hole over the spike, bunched it all up. I didn't bother gluing it, and threaded on my Stormtrooper helmets. They just sit in place, they're not glued or anything, and then they just sit there and bobble. Nearly there, just the canopy to go. I marked out where I wanted the supports, 15 centimetres apart, and I made them from bamboo skewers. I just painted them black-grey, and I drilled holes for them. Actually, this is enough. They didn't even need gluing, they just poke straight in and you can drape your canopy over the top. I fixed them in place with some dilute matte Mod Podge, but then when I tried the bike, that one side was too low. I was able to move them, the matte Mod Podge is quite wet still at this point, and then just dripped a little bit more on when I was happy about the final positioning. I let them dry and then powdered on just a little bit of tile grout. Then all I had to do was put in my speeder bike, put on the man himself, dust up his feet a bit so he looked like he'd been there a while, add a jetpack to cover that mount, and I was done. So here he is, finished and in place on this bookshelf where I'm trying to fill up with my dioramas. I've already got 2 downstairs full of them. This does make me laugh though. It's weighted towards the back, so it's beginning to lean back already, so I need to work on that. And if I just walk around actually, the Stormtrooper's go into bobble mode. It's really funny. So yeah, everything's always moving. It's fun. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, hit the bell button, support me on Patreon, buy a t-shirt, whatever you fancy. See you next time.